go ahead and still serve yourself, but I'm going to go ahead and keep this off so you can really hear me. And welcome you guys to our event today. Thank you to you all for being here for the first event for our Women's History Month here at USM. And our event today is Women Healers Through the Ages, Medieval Midwives to Mississippi Nurses. My name is Dr. Rebecca Tuuri. I'm an associate professor of history here. I'm also the co-director for the Center for the Study of the Gulf South. I am a member of the History Women's Caucus, and I'm also a member of the Committee on Services and Resources for Women. And all of those three entities are sponsors for today's event. So thank you to everyone. Thank you especially to Candace Salyers, and also Melanie Ludy, who helped to provide refreshments and help with the publicity. Thank you also to Tanya Follett on the Gulf Park campus, who helped with our beautiful poster. And thank you to many other unnamed people who I'm forgetting right now who helped with that. So thank you to all people who helped make this possible. I wanted to let you know, too, that if you're interested in learning more about women's history in the coming semesters, you have some options. So we will be teaching Women in American History, History 477 in the fall. I will be teaching that class. Dr. Luckhardt, along with Drs. Parker and Smithka in English and philosophy, respectively, will be teaching the interdisciplinary Humanities 201 Medieval Times, which I'm sure will have much on women. Dr. Stephens, is there something that you were teaching that is women related on women's history?
It could be women related. It's just going to be about coastal history.
Oh, wonderful. Excellent. So look for Dr. Stephens' course as well for the fall. Now I will move on to introducing our wonderful panelists for this event today. So first we will hear from Dr. Courtney Luckhardt, who is a medieval historian who received her Ph.D. in medieval studies from the University of Notre Dame. Her research focuses on the religious and cultural history of the Middle Ages, and she teaches courses on the Vikings and ancient and medieval women. Her first book was The Charisma of Distant Places, Travel and Religion in the Early Middle Ages, and it was published by Routledge in 2020. Her new project is focused on immigration and identity in northern Spain during the period of both Muslim and Christian conquest, circa 800 to 1000 CE. Next up, we will hear from Dr. Deanne Stephens, professor of history here at USM, who is the author of Plague Among the Magnolias, the 1878 yellow fever epidemic in Mississippi, and the Mississippi Gulf Coast seafood industry, A People's History. So two separate excellent works to check out. She has published also in numerous journals, also on topics from women's legislative representation to hookworm disease. She is the executive director of the Gulf South Historical Association and is a member of the Center for the Study of the Gulf South. Finally, we will hear from Ms. Jamie Stanfield, an assistant professor and the business and health librarian for university libraries at Southern Miss. She holds a master's degree in history and a master's degree in library science and is currently enrolled in our Ph.D. program here at USM. She is heavily involved with the use of graphic novels and is passionate about how these works increase literacy rates. She is active in several organizations, including the Medical Library Association, the National Medical Library, the American Library Association, Atmospheric Science Librarians International, and Graphic Medicine, and many others. So won't you please help me in welcoming our panelists today.
While I'm speaking. So I'm Dr. Courtney Luckhardt. I'm a medieval historian, and yes, I study the very, very distant past, but women have been healers for a very, very long time, and so I wanted to give us this kind of long time span in which to consider how women have engaged in a profession, and that the profession that is healing. And so healing is women's work, right? It was women's work in the Middle Ages. And it includes the fact that most women's work today and in the past has been, for pay, has been things that it has in common is that it is considered low skilled, even if it is not. It is often considered low status. and it is often low paid as in comparison to so-called men's work, right? And so one thing that is true both in the distant past and today is that when trades become more profitable and more prestigious, men start to try and take them over. And so this is true in the Middle Ages. Women's work was weaving, cloth production, it was brewing, it was medicine. And as these professions got more prestigious and had more money associated with them, in the later Middle Ages, they became male trades. So these are pink-collar professions in the Middle Ages as well. This is something, and so in women's work, men and women had different and defined separate social and economic roles in their communities, men's work and women's work. Women's lives were often more, and women's work was more confined to the home. They milked cows, they made butter, they ground grain and made bread, they spun wool cloth, and they birthed and both raised children, right? And that is the actual process of having a child, but also the women associated with helping you give birth, midwives. So a lot of what we know about medieval women comes from textual primary sources written at the time period, but it also comes from archaeology. And we actually know quite a bit about women's lives in the Middle Ages from their bones, right, from their grave sites. And there's been a fabulous study done on over 300 skeletons that were there was an archaeological dig, and on medieval English women. And these women, it was a much larger sample size, but the 300 plus were of women ages 14 to 25 that they did this particular study on. And why would a woman ages 14 to 25 be dying in the Middle Ages? Mostly from childbirth. But we can tell a lot, not just about their deaths, but also about their lives. They had an average height of 5'2", so they were short. This is primarily because of nutrition. Their average age at menarche, at their first period, which ages 15 to 16, right? Which is late compared to modern times. Again, mostly to do with nutrition. Their pelvic development was complete usually by age 19. Again, that is late compared to modern girls and women, and that is because mostly of the invention of modern medicine, which we'll be talking about, and also improved nutrition since the 19th century. But we can tell a lot about them as well, their lives. A lot of these women migrated from rural places to the cities for service work. And we can tell that by the muscles that they used and the different musculatures, what kinds of jobs they did. We also know that some of them had tuberculosis from overcrowded conditions and close quarters in those cities. Some of them had sinusitis from pollution, sort of pre-industrial pollution at that time as well. So we can tell a lot about their lives and their deaths from their bodies. We can also tell about them from material culture. The age and the time of life are a big part of the grave goods, the things that people bury with their loved ones. And those who died at the peak of their productivity, 14 to 25, these women had the most grave goods. And these were young women. They were buried with jewelry. They were buried with things that were valuable. Average life expectancies in the Middle Ages was 40. But that is not that everyone's going around dying at age 40. It's because of incredibly high infant mortality rates. It's because of incredibly high childhood mortality rates from diseases that we now have vaccines to. So this is a keyword, average. If a woman made it out of childhood, she would most likely survive to, sort of that pre-industrial lifespan age of around 60-ish, except for the sort of peak things that women did die from in their peak years, and for men, that is fighting, and for women, that is childbirth. It was incredibly dangerous. This is one particular woman. This is a 20-year-old woman who was buried in a church in the 15th century, and she was buried with her fetus in utero. And so, you can't see that in this picture. We're not archaeologists, but she was also buried with this gilded silver crucifix, and it was found in the North Aisle of St. Peter's, Barton-on-Humber, in England. Right. So this is the kind of thing. This is a 20-year-old girl, right, who died in childbirth. And was beloved and was buried with a crucifix and buried with something of great material value. So one of the key ways that women both participated in the labor market, but also tried to help protect one another in this very dangerous time of childbirth, was through midwifery, right? The profession of birthing children. So midwifery in the Middle Ages was focused on women's health needs. It was not sort of primarily doctor focused, it was primarily patient focused, if we can use those kinds of terminologies. And so childbirth was not seen as medical, which is why men did not birth children, right? Men were indeed doctors, but it was not considered a medical process, it was considered a natural process. And so that's why women were the primary caregivers. Remember, women's work is low status, it's low paid, and so this was seen as not doctoring, this is not medicine, but this is a separate thing, and it was a women's sphere of labor. This was the only lay person that is not a cleric in the entirety of the Middle Ages that was allowed to baptize people, right? And so, people believed if there was a child, an emergency, that midwife could baptize the baby just in case the baby didn't survive. And so no lay men were allowed to do this, and no other lay women were allowed to do this. So this was something specific to midwives. Childbirth was a time of incredible vulnerability for women. It still is today, right? We still have a high maternal mortality rate here in the state of Mississippi, and it was even higher in the pre-modern world. Healing was seen as domestic labor, right? There is nursing, there is caring for the sick, there is wet nursing, which is breastfeeding babies for pay, and often poor women did do that. Formula had obviously not been invented yet. There were also laundresses and chambermaids. This is a woman, she's not stirring soup, she is stirring laundry in a cauldron. It is it's like the worst job in the Middle Ages. And midwives themselves were exclusively women, and this included not just married women, but a category of women called single women. This was a legal category in the Middle Ages, and these women were independent women who, some of them had never married, and some of them were widows, but they had their own sort of economic and legal status in the Middle Ages, and often midwives were some of these single women who had their own money and their own legal status. So this is a depiction of a birth in a medieval manuscript, right? You can see the baby has come out healthy, yay everybody, right? Mom is in bed. Likely the two women in green and blue, this is a very high status woman giving birth, likely she had two midwives with her. So those two women are likely her midwives. They're dressed in nice clothing, but not really wealthy looking clothing. Probably the two women to that side are her relatives, older relatives. You can tell because they're wearing like two different dresses. They look much wealthier. But there's a whole host of other women who are employed, who are not just the ones who are giving, birthing the baby, but also doing other things, right? Filling the water pail, getting the laundry out. There's a whole sort of architecture of women's labor, not just the woman giving birth, but also the woman fetching the hot water and fetching the laundry and all of the things that go along with that. So it is actually quite a good job. It's important labor. So I do want to kind of take a little turn here and talk a little bit about the power that these women did wield, right? And so medieval magic, and we're going to talk about this just for a second here. Medieval magic is this word, it's not the same word that we think of as magic. It's this Latin word maleficium. It's the medieval belief in the power of human beings to either help one another or harm one another, right? Magic is seen as both positive and negative through magical means, or to dominate the environment and the forces of nature, right? So we think of magic as something separate from science and something separate from religion, but this is not how medieval people saw the world. Now that did change over time from about 1400 to 1650. These spheres started to get separated by the scientific revolution and things like that, but in the Middle Ages, the link between medicine and magic, that is transformation, was important. This could be in men's magic. Alchemy is men's magic, turning lead into gold or something like that. But it's also in herbal magic, women's magic, magic that is also transformational. These people would also, I'll finish up. Okay, so yeah, there are witches involved in this too, right? Why are these women like they are absolutely being persecuted? Witchcraft is this feminine transgression in the 14th century. 2/3 of the people accused were women, 80% in the 15th century. Again, this is about magic, this is about power, and this is also about how women were trying to keep and or have power taken from them through their work, through their labor of this important time. So anyway, thank you. Sorry, I went over. All right, so, and I'm happy to take questions at the end. Thank you.
So we're gonna jump to a specific medical issue many centuries beyond Dr. Luckhardt's, and that's gonna be the yellow fever epidemics, and specifically the 1878 yellow fever epidemic. And the reason that I've chosen the 1878 yellow fever epidemic is that during that epidemic in Mississippi, Mississippi experienced a 28% death rate. At the time, there was about 970,000 population in the state, and approximately 5,000, give or take, died during that epidemic, and it was considered quite significant. So Mississippi had an experience with yellow fever, and the very first thing the state had done, we can trace back to 1799, when the state established through the legislature, remember we're a territory at the time, but established a quarantine law. And just coming out of COVID, and some of this is going to sound very familiar, but quarantines were established, and in fact, throughout Mississippi's history, if you're familiar with the coast, Ship Island was a quarantine station, specifically for yellow fever until 1905. So the nursing situation in yellow fever had a couple of hundred years to develop. Mississippi will be plagued with yellow fever from the time D'Iberville arrives in 1699, and its last epidemic will be in 1905. So this is a disease that kept a stranglehold on society and on economics, and to a great deal of influenced political development in the state. So traditionally, as Dr. Luckhardt was talking, women had always been nurses within their household. And each year, yellow fever was going to appear. People knew that, but until the mosquito vector comes along and is recognized in the late 19th century and early 20th century, no one knew how it was transmitted. And I always find it so very sad when I read primary sources and the people who are keeping the journals or writing the letters are saying, oh, the mosquitoes are so bad this year. And I can just picture them, you know, and not having any idea that it was that Aedes aegypti mosquito that was carrying that virus. So the women of the household often were the nurses. In 1853, there was a high watermark epidemic. In fact, John Duffy, several years ago, wrote a wonderful book and called New Orleans the necropolis of the South. So many people died. And since 1853, then through the American Civil War, there were specific groups that were developed that were created for nursing care. And I'd like to look at those groups just very, very briefly. And what we find is that there were two orders, the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity. Both of those orders were instrumental and so pivotal in the 1853 epidemic. Then they continued their nursing care through the American Civil War. And then by the time we get to the devastating 1878 epidemic, they have established themselves as clerics who are giving nursing care to everyone, regardless of race or socioeconomic status. So these two orders in 1878 played a vital role in helping with nursing care. So why is nursing care so important in yellow fever? Well, yellow fever can be a very hideous, frightening disease. If you have a mild case, it would be very close to having flu. But you didn't know what you had. So you developed then the natural antibodies, and perhaps you would be safe for the next viral attack, depending upon if the virus mutated or not. And we've heard this for 2 years now. So with, however, a severe attack of yellow fever, this is when it gets really, really nasty. The body actually just hemorrhages, and one of the nicknames for yellow fever is black vomit, because the poor patient literally is vomiting his or her own semi-digested blood. So the fear instilled by yellow fever, many communities were loath to even say that they had yellow fever within their environment because it really elicited such panic throughout the population. So what happened and everybody knew how horrible yellow fever was. Remember, we've had it in Mississippi for those several hundred years. So what we find is that as soon as yellow fever was diagnosed, and there is no hiding it, when yellow fever also got its name yellow fever, the liver is having issues and terrible jaundice set in. So with the black vomit, with the jaundice, and with the high death rate, communities couldn't hide this. And what happened was those who could got out of town. So potential nurses who were of a certain socioeconomic group, people who could have helped, they are so fearful of the disease that they're fleeing. So this then comes to the importance of the Sisters of Mercy and the Sisters of Charity in the 1878 yellow fever epidemic, because they didn't flee. They stayed to help anyone and everyone. And 2 cities that really quickly were Vicksburg and Holly Springs. I don't know if anybody's from Vicksburg area or Holly Springs in the very north of the community. But we find that these 2 cities had a large population, particularly the Sisters of Charity in Holly Springs. And they stayed with the Catholic priest there, Father Oberti, to nurse all. And it's really wonderful because, well, wonderful is sort of weird, excuse me, but the church still stands, the buildings are still there, and in fact they now have what they call a martyrs museum in Holly Springs to yellow fever, because these sisters who stayed, including the Catholic priest, out of 12 of them, 6 of them died. So this is what we find with nurses, that as a nurse, whether you were associated with an order or not, you knew that you were taking your life in your own hand, because try to imagine, as I've tried to, standing there in Holly Springs, you have no idea where this disease is coming from. Is it a miasma? Is it fomites that you touch? Is it something that you do? You have no idea. So to operate in that kind of ignorance and that fear, and then knowing what could happen with yellow fever. So the Sisters of Charity were extremely important, and nurses were important for several reasons. Of course, there were 3 nursing schools. Nursing was on the cusp, and Miss Stanfield, I'm sure, can talk more than I can on that. But the history of nursing, it's on the cusp of development. By this time in 1878, there's 3 professional nursing schools, Boston, New York, and New Haven, Connecticut, that have come about. That's a far way from Mississippi. So Mississippi is still relying upon what I like to think of as, for the most part, the clerical, the nuns that came in, and community women who were doing this for nursing care. So the other one, the Sisters of Mercy, were mostly in Vicksburg, and that particular house just shut down in the last, say, 10 years. So if this was something you were interested in, you actually could go there and do primary research on their records that were there. The Sisters of Mercy also lost a lot in Vicksburg. They were at St. Paul's Church, and out of the sisters that were there, about 50% of them also died of yellow fever. And you can go see the graves of all of these and the epitaphs that praise these sisters for the work that they did. So that is one group of nurses that we had. The second group was a group of volunteers that worked for a group out of New Orleans called the Howard Association. And the Howard Association had been created in the 1830s specifically to aid yellow fever. And it started out as a group of philanthropic men. They pooled money, they bought food, they bought provisions, and they hired doctors and nurses. And out of New Orleans, because New Orleans was so impacted by yellow fever because of its connections to the Caribbean and South American, Central American trade, New Orleans always heralded yellow fever really for the rest of the South. So we see this Howard Association developing. And the Howards then would hire nurses. And they would pay the nurses, they would hire doctors. So volunteers were coming in 1878 from across the United States, being paid through the Howard Association. A good nurse was paid on average $4 a day. When times got desperate, it went up to $5. Doctors were paid $10 a day, plus they got a horse and buggy. So we go to this discrepancy in pay even in 1878. So the Howard Association received telegraphs constantly, and one of them, for God's sake, send nurses. Nurses offered comfort, they kept patients clean, medicines were rudimentary at best, but they were more there for the, I think, mental health and physical well-being of the patient, because yellow fever could not be combated yet. It was still in its early stages. The last nurse I'd like to mention is a woman named Clara Moss. She was 25 years old. She was part of the international team who was trying to find, where does yellow fever come from? And this would have been in 1898 in Las Animas Hospital, Cuba. She volunteered. Her mother needed the money, $2. She volunteered to be bit by a mosquito, and upon her death of yellow fever, she was one of the last then that proved that it was mosquito vectors. So nurses have played a vital role not only in aiding and comforting yellow fever patients, but actually in finding a cure and how that disease was spread. Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to pick up right about the same time as Dr. Stephens, but I'll be looking at Mississippi Midwives. There's not a lot of scholarship about Mississippi Midwives. We don't have any absolute interviews towards the turn of the century, just after the Civil War. Prior to the Civil War in Mississippi, the majority of babies were delivered by enslaved African American females. Not only did they deliver the other enslaved women's babies, but also sometimes other people's babies. They could be hired out. If the plantation owner or the business owner that owned the slave felt like giving them something, sometimes they did. Other times they did not. Some women experienced a little bit more freedom than they wouldn't have had they not been in that position. Even during, prior to the Civil War, these women were held highly in their communities because they were the ones bringing forth life. It still was a female-dominated experience. And so even without the benefit of modern medicine, they still managed to deliver these babies over and over and over. This is going to continue even after the Civil War. And so after the Civil War, as we get into the dawn of the 20th century, midwives are still right in the heart of their community, delivering the babies. But a problem arises. As we get into the progressive era and our public becomes more interested in public health, and we really start to take notice of the birth and death rates, we start having birth certificates, death certificates, and are realizing that our maternal child rates are horrendous. We have mothers and babies both dying. The two major reasons, hemorrhage and infection. this has been for hundreds and hundreds of years the major reason that mothers and babies die when they're delivering. And so what ends up happening is these midwives continue to work in their community, even though they're now free. They're still, a lot of them, near the same places they were, if not on the same areas that they were and working. But now it is more of a profession. They tend to be in very impoverished communities where oftentimes they're paid with chickens or vegetables, because Mississippi at the time in the early 1900s was still predominantly rural. And there wasn't a lot of extra jobs, and we also have to deal with the extreme racism against African Americans that was going on at the time. And so what ends up happening is, for the impoverished, it didn't really matter what color your skin was. When women went into labor, these women stepped up and helped them. Now, sometimes, especially at the turn of the century, obstetrics is growing, but it's not the lucrative business that it's going to become in the, say, by the 40s and 50s. It's really more of a practice. So you have a lot of the schools where African Americans could go and get a degree in medicine close after 1910, after the Flexner Report. What ends up happening, Johns Hopkins takes the lead, and a lot of medical schools are closed. We don't have any nursing schools that are open to African American women in the area. We still mainly see these up north. And what we see happening when we really start getting an idea of our maternal and infant death rates is blame it on the midwives. It has to be their fault. You know, we have the germ theory established in the mid-1870s, but it's really not going to make a big difference until we have an understanding of blood transfusion, infection, sterility, you know, these types of things that we now know. And so what you see across the country in the South is it's all the midwives' fault, and these are 98% African American women. In the North, it's all the immigrants' fault. They have their own areas with their own midwives, and everybody had their own kind of cultural practices that came over from wherever they originated from that tended to last. The North was way ahead of the South as far as that, you know, that lineage of hospitals, doctors, public health, because there were so many more larger cities there. And in the South, we had far fewer doctors, far fewer hospitals, far fewer means of public health. Mississippi had a public health department in the late 1890s, but really this didn't get going until about the 1920s. And in the 1920s, Felix J. Underwood became the director of the Mississippi Public Health Department. And he has a very, very long record of extreme racism against the midwives of Mississippi. As early as 1912, he has an article where he discusses their origin, he called them ignorant, he called them dirty, and just really blamed all of Mississippi's maternal infant death rates on these midwives. So as we move along, obstetrics is coming around. A lot of times doctors were able to go and practice in the community. There was a belief that Black women didn't feel pain as much as white women, which we know is not true. Also, they could go out and deliver babies and practice, and if anything went wrong, not much was going to happen. Because at the time, if you look at the social status, the Black woman was the absolute lowest on the social totem pole in Mississippi and other states as well. But nothing was done about doctors going out into these rural communities and practicing. Most of them didn't want to anyway. Even the few hospitals that we did have at the time had a tendency to turn away African American patients. If they didn't, it was usually a long buggy ride. So if you had a woman who had complications as she was giving birth, and you had to go to the hospital and there was no doctor, a lot of times the hospital is just too far away, and the time it was going to take you to get there, the woman may hemorrhage to death, or just a multitude of complications. So the midwives continued to take this up. In 1921, a public health nurse is hired, and her whole job is to go through Mississippi and name and locate all of the midwives that were practicing. She found about 4,200, a little over 4,200. And that's just those that were willing to divulge information. Very quickly, permits were required for midwives, okay? So in order to get your permit and continue practicing, you had to go to sometimes twice weekly, but at least weekly meetings in your area. More public health nurses were hired, about 7 to start out with for the entire state. And what you did is you went to this little, usually schoolhouse, and they were forced to wear white uniforms because they were told that the clothing they had was dirty. They were forced to show the public health nurse their bag. They were not allowed to carry any herbs, any type of cultural herbs that had been used and passed down from generation to generation out. They had to do so many different things. They weren't allowed to check the woman to see how far along she was in labor. That's a standard. You need to know these. As a former labor and delivery nurse, I assure you, you need to know where you're at in the delivery process. They were banned from doing this. So they, and meanwhile, the Southern medical journals that we have are still coming out blaming the midwife. It's their fault. They don't have any kind of clean techniques. So as obstetrics is rising at the time, as we get into the 30s and 40s, what we see, and I was really shocked when I first found this in my research, is comparatively, the obstetricians out in these rural communities had a higher maternal and infant death rate than the midwives. That's because these ladies were experienced with what they were doing. This is a generational thing. They have something called mother wit and magic. They know what to do, and they apprentice their granddaughters, nieces, and daughters. And so this has been handed down over hundreds and even thousands of years. I mean, it's the oldest profession for females in the world. So as they continued to do these meetings, they would get told that, well, you're a little too old, not going to renew your permit. You had this in your bag. I found some jasmine in your bag, not going to renew your permit. And very quickly, you start to see this number cut in half. By the 1930s, we're down to less than 2,000 midwives. Across the southern portion of the country, there is absolutely no give in what was the midwife, what was causing all this problem, and it was female blackness. That was considered at the time ignorant, dirty, it's all their fault, and we know now that that is not the case. Those white male obstetricians were losing more mamas and losing more babies than these well-trained, experienced midwives. So ultimately, what's going to end up happening is they're going to be regulated out of the profession. By the 1950s, Mississippi has a good deal of federal money given to them to build hospitals, more rural clinics, more health departments, and basically they just stopped renewing and just stopped giving permits. The problem is, though, these women, as the rise of hospitals and obstetrics, they figure out this is a cash cow, and it still is to this day. These midwives were not offered roles in any of the hospitals because this was saved for registered nurses from a school. And the problem there was a lot of these women were not able to go to school. Even if they were accepted, they probably couldn't afford it because we're a rural, poor community. And what ends up happening is midwifery becomes a university level degree and certification required, and you're going to spend about 6 years in school. Today, we actually have, Mississippi has 2 titles for non-degree midwives. That's a direct entry midwife and doulas. And they, even though they're not allowed to do medications and certain things, they kind of act in that classic atmosphere. We still have a lot of difference in nursing. It's still female dominated, but also white male, but female dominated. All right, so there we are. That's it.
Thank you all for coming. I'm sorry, we have to go ahead and shut this down in order to make room for the next class. But if you want to continue the conversation, can I ask my panelists to stay in the lobby area and answer any questions that you might have? Thank you so much again for coming. And have a wonderful weekend.
I know.
It does. You guys get good.
I was afraid I wasn't gonna. Goodbye, Allison. Goodbye, Mr. Webex.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Hi, Deanne.
No, it's fine.
I tried my
all
best.
understand. We understand, right?
There's a lot of commonality. Yeah, we're
Because he mentioned to us yesterday that he was going to be in Laurel. So that was it. It needs a number of certifications from education professor.
Anyway, it's so exciting to be in
Those that I never got back to me. We never got back to me. It's like,